Good afternoon and good morning to all. And thank you for joining the AVNation webinar, Delivering the Experience, High Resolution Switchers and Media Servers. I am your host, Wallace Johnson from WLJ Consulting, and want to announce our sponsor for the webinar, Watch Out. Watch Out is a media server solution and the #1 multi-display production and playback system. Perfect for live events and fixed installations. Watch Out is infinitely scalable, supports projection mapping, uncompressed video, and that product is brought to you by Dataton. So to introduce our panel, first going to start with Tim Cashel from Evolve Media Group. Tim is a 20-year veteran of the AV industry who has worked with some of the largest live event production companies and manufacturers in the industry, building and designing video systems. Today, he helps develops the skills of the industry through video with Evolve's Training Academy and serves as the Director of Technology for Evolve Media Group. Next, I would like to introduce Phil Bergeron, President of Paintscaping. A pixel magic maker, Phil holds a master in computer science from the University of Montreal, which has allowed him to specialize in AR and computer animation. His background has allowed him to create, manage, and illustrate some amazing content around the world through projection mapping on hundreds of major projects. But in his spare time, he's an actor and has appeared in more than 50 films and TV shows, most notably Iron Man 2, Mad Men, Entourage, The Shield, Rush Hour 3, Godzilla, and The Sopranos. So when you get a moment, Google Phil Bergeron and Marvel. You'll see he's kind of close to Tony Stark. Next is Drew Taylor, video engineer of High Resolution Engineering. He designs video systems and is an engineer specialist with some very high resolution switching systems. Drew has engineered hundreds of shows using the industry's most high powered systems and projects such as ESPN, the ESPYs, the MTV Movie Awards, and the Beijing Olympics. So gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's jump into today's topic. And I first want to start with talking a little bit just about resolutions in general. And Drew, I'll start with you with this question. Why is 4K having such an impact on live events? It seems like with 4K, a lot of products have shifted faster and are expanding and building around 4K. Tell me a little bit about why this is having such an impact on the live event space.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, screen output, we've been doing far beyond 4K for years on large LED walls and blended projection. So when we talk about the adoption of 4K, really I think of like the adoption of 4K on single displays or single cable path solutions or, 4K cameras, that kind of stuff. And it is a big increase because it really ups the ante on what we can do with total systems now that we have actual 4K processing, 4K chips, and 4K on single cables. Sorry. And most of the shows that I see haven't moved 100% to 4K yet. Now some have definitely, but a large majority are using some sort of kind of in-between hybrid still, where maybe the media server inputs or the backgrounds might be coming in 4K or something, between 2K and 4K to give us widescreen backgrounds, while some of the other sources are still 1080 and, cameras are still in a lot of cases HD. So it's definitely been kind of a slow transition to 4K, and we're seeing a lot of shows kind of being in that in-between state and having a mixture of 2K and 4K sources.
Tim, I'm gonna ask you a similar question, but I want to frame it a little differently, just based on the input Drew gave. The industry is shifting, but it seems to be, kind of a slower process with some of the other components. You've been deeply involved in designing video systems for some major staging partners, and you worked for a manufacturer for years. What's your viewpoint on looking at 4K on live events, the progression towards it, its pace. Give us a little bit of input on what you think about that.
Well, I'd have to agree with Drew that the 4K resolution is more of a transport stream right now. It's not that we're displaying to 4K necessarily, but it does give us the ability to push a lot of pixels down a single pipe. But in terms of the technology, it's more of a palette right now. 4K is more of a content tool, and we're using the switchers that are available to divide that up into different displays or to cover large LED spaces.
Got it. So looking at our next question, under this resolution topic, Phil, I want to talk with you about this. Should the industry be looking to shift faster? It sounds like, from what Drew and Tim said, there's a progression. You know, should they be using this technology better to produce a better product with integrating more 4K into their systems?
Well, I'm going to have to agree with Tim and Drew that we've been doing 4K, but 4K in the mapping world, 4K, I mean, what is 4K? So we're preparing a gig at the area, which is 10K by 1K. So we do a lot of projects that are, if you think of 4K, 4K is just a number of pixels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so the number of pixels could change, but the aspect ratio could change. So we've been doing that for years. Especially when you use multi-projectors, you're far beyond 4K.
Yep.
So. For mapping, is 8K over, I mean, if you think aspect ratio 16:9 is 8K overkill, well, yes and no. I mean, it all depends on the size of your canvas and how far is your audience, from the canvas. We're doing a gig right now in Sedona where the throw, believe it or not, is 1 kilometer. Our projectors are 1 kilometer away from the canvas on a mountain. So even though the mountain is 600 feet by 350, because people are so far, you don't need the resolution. So it all depends on a multiple of factors.
Interesting enough. Let's jump to the next question because I want to talk about, beyond 4K in other parts of the industry. They're looking and talking about, 8K being at a faster adoption, with people seeing the impact and the results of what 4K is, and it's a slower mover to 4. So by the time they truly look at 4, 8 will be here. In the live event space, do you think it's going to be that same concept of shifting to a higher resolution faster in our systems, after we've seen the benefits of 4K? Drew, I'll start with you in terms of your feedback on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we're talking 4K or 8K, I really see the industry split into two major segments from a technology standpoint, and that's broadcast technologies that involve cameras, SDI signal formats, and camera switching style systems, and then you have these computer-based signals that are HDMI and DisplayPort and DVI and the sources are media servers and our PowerPoint computers and that kind of stuff. And you really see a different adoption in both of those markets. The broadcast technology is very focused on what's the broadcast industry doing. Are we broadcasting 8K yet? And the computer industry is more based on what's NVIDIA and the GPUs capable of, as well as all the switching equipment in between. So I guess to answer the question a little bit better, if you think of it from a broadcast technologies perspective, if 4K solution is 4 cables, does an 8K solution mean 16 cables per signal? And if the answer is yes, then I think the adoption of 8K will be very slow. If you have 16 cables per signal, that's just going to significantly increase the complexity of your system. I mean, even moving the broadcast systems into 4K and having quad SDI solutions means all your routers and infrastructure that you would normally need, you have to multiply that by 4. So now you have bigger routers, bigger switchers, with higher capacity, inputs and outputs just to handle the same amount of cameras. So, I think we're going to see faster adoption with 8K in computer-based signals, where you have NVIDIA and the GPU companies really driving, higher horsepower on DisplayPort. But the challenge you're always going to have is that in-between technology, the signal extension, the routers, the processors all have to be able to catch up to that as well.
Great point. And Tim, I want to ask you this question as a follow-up, because you've been in the manufacturer world. I'm sure you still talk with them very closely. You're involved as reviewing and analyzing technology for Evolve and looking at what's the next thing. How close do you think we are to manufacturers being ready to produce 8K systems at the pace and volume they're producing 4K systems?
I think it's going to be a lot faster adoption than it was going from HD to 4K. I can remember years back, producing stuff in HD and then saying, okay, can we produce in 4K? And everything was more expensive to do it. Today, doing a 4K production or doing HD productions are about the same cost. The equipment's there, everything to do a production or to switch in 4K exists. And I would agree that, what's the justification for 8K? Yeah, the manufacturers have to look at what infrastructure is there going to be, what's going to be the signal type that's going to be that 8K solution. I can't imagine a 24G SDI with a 50-foot cable limit. It's going to be kind of impossible.
Yeah.
So it's looking to what that next system is. And the big challenge is we have, there's events that happen that are benchmarks. And the Tokyo Olympics in 2020, Panasonic's talking about doing 8K, cameras and projectors and transmission with NHK. And so it's out there. Something's probably going to come out with 8K at that Olympics. Whether anybody picks it up afterwards is yet to be seen. But it's usually at least a 2 to 3 year ramp up for any manufacturer to get on board with like a new technology like 8K. But it will happen faster than the transition to 4K.
Phil, I'll close this question out with you because, from a content standpoint, especially with mapping, with several media servers out there, they're already marketing and advertising 8K as a resolution that they will manage fairly easily, they state. So how does the adoption of 8K look from, a mapping artist standpoint? Is that something you think will come on board faster?
Well, we're already there. That's the thing, is that 8K is like Drew was saying, it's a 4x4 signal. Like, for example, we use the Boxer. You guys are probably familiar with the Boxer, Christy, which is a 4K projector, but it really was a 4 HD signal. So when you go to 8K, the big question that Drew, I believe, introduces, how easy is it to manage the content? We don't really do IMAG or cameras here, so it's irrelevant to us whether it's 8K cameras or any input. We generate the content. So, but we've been generating the content at 8K for years now, but it's just not the traditional 16:9 aspect ratio. When you have 10 projectors in your show, you are generating 8K's worth of resolution, but it could be on 3 to 4 walls. So, but I agree that 8K will go faster than 4K. It's just, will we be able to manage with one signal as opposed to 16? That's the big question, is the management of the content is the key question in the adoption of 8K.
Interesting stuff. So moving on to, narrowing down and looking at high resolution switching systems. The landscape of 4K switches out there is fairly large. Some would think it's pretty crowded. Drew, what are some of the key changes recently that you've seen, in the switching space when it comes to switchers now being able to manage 4K resolution?
Yeah, I'd say in the past several years, the big changes or evolutions we've seen in high-res switching and image processors is the obvious movement to 4K. And we had some of those technologies doing what I would say the in-between, where it was 4K 30, and now a lot of them have caught up and are doing full 4K 60 on single input channels, HDMI and DisplayPort. So the movement to 4K is an obvious big one. And secondly, over the past several years, in the, speaking in the image processors and switchers and live events, we've seen a huge shift into software-based control and programming applications for these switchers. Even just several years ago, it was a primary workflow to program switchers, and everything was button-based and hardware console-based, where now almost everything can be 100% driven from software, and the hardware button panels are more of a luxury or a style choice. So if you look at like the big ones in the event space, we're talking like Barco E2. They transitioned from Encore to E2 and dropped the need for programming in a console and went more software based. And Christie with the Spider X20 and X80, they've also now moved to full 4K 60, and the Spider's always been a very software based programming application. And they've really packed more into these processors. So instead of having this system that consists of all these different image processors and external routers and this complicated engineering setup, they've really packed more into individual processors. With that, and along with the software-based configuration, it's making them, I'd say, a lot more accessible to a much wider audience, because it's taken a lot of the complex engineering out of these screen switching systems, especially on the kind of small to medium-sized shows.
Indeed. And looking at, like I say, and comparing to scaling a lot into a processing card, and looking at the next question, Tim, broadcast style switchers seem to be being used quite more often in the live event space compared to what I'll call a image processing unit. Why is that?
And I think the big reason for that is that the 4K switching has been around for a little bit now, and there are broadcast switchers that'll do 4K. In fact, most of the manufacturers are coming out with 12 GSDI versions. So you're not switching on quad 4K anymore. You're doing a single cable. So it kind of does what 3 GSDI did for 1080p. So now it gives you a one cable solution. It's nice for compact production. A lot of the switchers today on the production side and the broadcast side, they have the features that you have in a lot of the high-res switchers. They have mixing auxes. They have the ability to write more of a preset versus a snapshot. They have a familiar interface. So if you've been to a broadcast school or you switched in a truck, you can transition into a high resolution system and be able to have a familiar interface. And that being said, when I was at Barco and we introduced the FSN, when we did back in 2008, what we learned is a lot of people in the industry at that time never had switched on a production switcher. Most people had switched on some sort of, high resolution system that had a button panel, like Drew said, that had presets. And the idea of switching with preview and program and MEs was foreign to them. And I think over time, more people have gotten familiar with that style of switching again. So that's why we're probably seeing a resurgence in production switcher types.
Very, very interesting. So in looking at, broadcast switchers, high resolution image switcher, data switchers, Drew, from a next question standpoint, as an engineer in the field, you've done a lot of high-end shows using a number of different systems. What should go into the decision-making process for an engineer when it looks at, hey, this is the switcher that I need for this type of show? And Tim, I'm going to follow up with you from a company perspective with the same question.
Yeah. So, I mean, from an engineering or from a needs perspective, I would, the biggest two considerations I would have in looking at what switcher you want to buy is what's your workflow and what's the average capacity of your shows. So what's the desired workflow of the operator? Who is the operator to begin with, and what are they most comfortable with? An operator engineer with a heavy broadcast background might be more inclined to go with the production switcher, where engineer with more of a media server or high-res engineering type of background, they might want more of like your image processor, high-resolution switcher. But again, I'd look at like what is your average show in terms of inputs, outputs, and needs of that show. And let's say you do 20 shows a year and 18 of them kind of fit the profile of your average, and 2 shows are bigger than that. Well, that's where we help people, is helping on those larger shows that maybe are outside of their normal day-to-day landscape or size, and we help supply the gear and engineering and operator to make that show happen. So, that's what I would say: workflow and capacity, and just look at who's your operator and what the average size show you're doing is.
Tim, same question to you from a company perspective. How do you go about looking at this from, selecting the right product line that's going to be the right fit for your operation in terms of, supply and demand, what the field needs? How do you look at, making the decision of selecting a product for your organization?
Well, first of all, I agree with Drew that as a company, you have to follow the 80% rule. What do 80% of your shows look like, input and output wise? For us, being a rental company, it's a little different. We have to kind of gauge, what's going to be that phone call. Is someone going to call for a full-blown system? They're going to call for something, smaller. For us, it's kind of, we have to get all the bells and whistles because we just don't know what the phone call is going to be. If you have a production company, you're choosing a switcher, obviously you can look at what your customers are asking you for and what your shows look like. So it's a little bit easier. Also look at, if you have to go and expand your system, do you have partners that you work with, or other companies in your area that have, do they have that XYZ box that you're thinking about getting? And then also finding resources as far as, the cross rentability in other cities. If you're going to be traveling a lot to a certain city, is there companies there that you can partner with that have the same gear? So that's probably the biggest thing from our perspective as far as a rental company is, okay, we have to basically stock everything that the product has options for.
Drew, I want to circle back on that one because on this question, mainly because just from an outsider's perspective, it seems like there's a lot of boxes now that have the similar number of inputs, similar number of outputs. So, from managing a show of what your typical show is, the product line of boxes are going to be very similar. And what it seems like a lot of lines are just copying the scale and capabilities of each other and crowding that space. How does things like access to training and UI interfaces, especially because a lot of them are going more software-based control. How does that play into your decision as an engineer in terms of evaluating which one's the right fit?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. And that comes back to the engineer operator. I mean, we subrent multiple different types of processing systems and build with different manufacturers, technologies, and support them. So, if you're an AV company and you're looking to buy something for your inventory, who's your operators? Is it a staff operator? Do you have a pool of freelancers? Ask them what are they using? What are they more comfortable with? That they do does your guys have more of like a Barco background, or they have more of a Spider background? They've used Christie in the past, and it's a natural progression to upgrade to the new technology because you have some familiarity there. Support and training is an obvious additional factor. You should definitely get proper training on whatever products you are using, and make sure your engineers and your operators have proper shop time with that technology, so they're not getting it dumped on them for the first time on show site. So yeah.
Okay, thanks for that input. So moving to the same discussion, but around the media server technology. media servers have grown drastically over the past 3 years, their capabilities, especially with what I saw on the show floor, most recently at Infocom. Phil, you've worked with a number of different media server products. Can you give us a brief overview of how, media servers have evolved over the past 3 years?
Yeah. By the way, you have a question later on, media server or switchers, which makes it sound that like it's one or the other. Most switchers do not play back, so it's not an or, but it's more of a and. Media servers will do some of the switching capabilities, but usually switchers don't play back. Although maybe the new E2 does, but I don't think they are playing back just yet. So in our case, in the mapping world, we're usually slave to the switcher, by the way. So we usually handle only the media server part, but the switcher is at a higher level that controls all the elements of the show. All right, media servers. Well, we use a bunch of different media servers, from Watch Out to Pandora's Box to D3, now This Guys. Why choose one over the other? Well, the client, obviously, if the client has a preference, we will go with it. But other than that, the reason we would use one over the other, logistics. I believe it's been a few years since we've used Watch Out, but I think the Watch Out model is that the content is near each projector, and so your cabling is only control and not fiber. So that would be a big advantage of Watch Out over the others, is you reduce your fiber cabling. So yeah, I mean, all three, D3, Pandora's Box, Watch Out, the big three. But Barco has a media server as well. Pandora's owned by Christie, so yeah, we're pretty flexible.
Got it. And so in terms of looking at media servers, they come now, many in software packages, and a lot have built out their own hardware solutions. Is there a preference in terms of which format is better in terms of building your own box and just using the software, or going with a turnkey hardware solutions? What have you found has been a best approach from your perspective?
If the question's still to me, could you define software versus hardware? Because every media server uses software and hardware. Like, would you say Resolume would be a software solution and D3 a hardware solution? Is that what you mean?
So looking at the software, it's software only. So you're using the media server software, but have built your own hardware to
I see.
go out, and then the hardware, meaning that the media server software and hardware product from the media server company is one unit, from like an AV Stumful of that aspect or something.
Well, I mean, we don't build our hardware here. We're going to use, but today, I mean, there's not. I mean, if you think of This Guys /D3 as a hardware solution, then we do prefer hardware solutions. But other than that, we sometimes we'll use a little more prosumer media servers like Resolume. It really varies on if you want more control over your live manipulation.
And which side brings more control, the turnkey hardware solution or the self-built software only solution?
Well, I mean, if you guys want to jump in here, but I would say software. And sometimes we use media servers that are the dumbest servers on the planet, like Alcorn McBride. And I don't mean dumb in a derogative way here. Like Alcorn McBride is a phenomenal media server, but it's only hardware. I mean, you press play and that's it, and it's 8 CF cards that work in sync. It's a fantastic media server, but it is very, very basic, and that's used for a lot of permanent installs and not necessarily live shows.
Got it. Tim, same question from your perspective. You guys distributor rent a media server product, have you found, and that has both software and a hardware element to it, um, which have you found from a market standpoint has been more preferred?
Well, for the smaller projects, like for single playback or you're doing a main playback and backup, we've used Pro Video Player. It's a software-based solution that runs on a Mac and kind of a replacement for Playback Pro. But the same kind of idea, it runs on whatever Mac hardware you have. For the larger stuff, basically anything that goes beyond, 2 or 3 screens, we start getting into large palettes. We go to hardware solutions for all the servers there. I think the hardware solution for us, again, rental company, you have to kind of get products that are working and reliable. So having a hardware solution means it's tested, it's been tried and tested by the manufacturer, and also puts the onus on the manufacturer if something's not right. You can say, okay, some tests what's going on. Is there a new driver for something in your box? Whereas if you put the box together yourself, you call the manufacturer and said, I'm not having a problem with the software. They're like, what's your hardware? And then it's like, well, we don't support this, we don't support that. So I think the hardware solution is best from the production or rental standpoint. Software is fine for the 1 screen or 2 screen playback solution.
Very good. Drew, and looking at the next question, out in the field, a lot of media servers I see promote the element of being able to manage blends, and they have their camera systems. I know, a lot of the newer projectors have camera systems as well that they're putting out with their projections. But do you find that projectionists are using the media server component more to manage the blend, or are they still free forming it through the projector only?
That's a good question, and I think it totally depends on the application and will vary depending on the application. So if you look at like large format projection mapping where you're projecting onto like non-standard surfaces, then definitely yes, you would be using mapping and warping and blending in the media server. Like Phil was talking about, projecting onto the side of a mountain, you're definitely going to use the media server for your warping and blending like that. So it definitely depends on the application. If you look at like an average corporate show where you're projecting onto a flat or even a curved surface, but it's not some funky non-standard thing, then typically blending and warping is done in the projector and done best in the projector in that environment. So I mean, I've always thought with the need for blending is due to overlapping light from projectors, right? So ultimately it's a projection issue, and if it can be fixed in the projector, then it should be. And a good projectionist, no matter the application, will recognize this factor and properly account for the right geometry and physical alignment of the projectors, if at all possible, as a first measurement. The image processors as well as the media servers have the blending capability. So I guess, whether you do that in the projectors or media server image processor is going to depend on, well, who's your projectionist and how good is the projectionist, and also how much time you have. I mean, it typically will take more time to do your warping and blending in projectors properly, where in the media server image processor, there's typically some quick handles that maybe can rough it in faster. So hope that answers.
No, it really does, especially when it talks about the speed of getting it done. Like I say, perception-wise, it looks like it could get done faster with media servers, versus, like I say, going to the projectors, managing it through the internal software. Tim, in looking at that though, even though you have the ability through media servers to manage this, what do you think would prevent projectionists from wanting to use a media server to manage the blend?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that makes media servers the last thing in the chain. So that's the last thing that goes out to the screens, and that means that all the content, with an iMag or any kind of PowerPoint, might be subject to latency issues or other issues of going through the media server. So that would be the one thing I would say is most people just don't have enough trust in media servers being the show switching system to be the last thing before projection. That being said, that there are advantages to the camera systems, and I think their place is probably most popular right now in like museum installs, doing dome mappings, or doing simulation projects. But for live events, like Drew said, the curves and the straight screens, it's do it in the projector and spend the time to do it right.
Very good. So, Phil, again, you worked with a number of different products. You alluded to this earlier in terms of like what a little bit of your decision-making process is when it comes to media server products, what the client wants. From a artist perspective, how do you look at which product you prefer for the project? So if the client leaves it open for you to decide, what's your thought process and kind of review when it comes to selecting which media server you want to work with for the project?
Right. Oh, by the way, one quick note on blends. In mapping, we try not to do blends. And we can because typically, and I'm sorry about the previous question, but in mapping, you use the architectural lines as the end of a mask and the beginning of the next. So we try to avoid blends, because blends, you will lose about 20% resolution because you need your overlap. So if you're on a white screen, you don't have a choice. But in the mapping world, we use the lines of the building, and that basic as the end of one projector and the beginning of the next, not the projector, but the mask. And this way, if there's a discrepancy between the two, we could always blame reality on this. So, and that allows us to avoid doing blends. But if we do blends, by the way, at the projector level is typically where we're going to use Barco or Twist Christie, or although all the major media servers have a nice warp and blend. All right, coming back to your question, what do we use? Well, sometimes it's very pedestrian. Do you want the pedestrian answer, Wallace?
Yeah. Like I say, this is from your perspective of, hey, I got a great project for you. You get to pick the solution. Kind of what goes into your.
What do we is John available? Is John a D3 guy? Great. Is Bob available? Oh, he's a watch out. Let's do watch out. Call VR. Is watch out available? Great. If it's not, Pandora's box. Awesome. Sometimes it doesn't really matter, to be honest. More and more people it's merging. I would say if you need live 3D, manipulation, this guy's /D3 may be the best. If you want your minimize your fiber run and just run a control, then maybe watch out is the best. But typically it doesn't really matter at the end of the day on our end. As long as it plays back and it plays back the number of inputs, we're good to go.
Very good. So looking at from a signal standpoint, you guys have brought it up with fiber kind of being a main transportation piece, sounds like, for long distances. Do you think we'll get to a point, Tim, I'll start with you with this question. Do you think we'll get to a point where fiber cards are kind of standard in these technologies?
Maybe. It's the biggest problem with any fiber solution is whose protocol or whose encoding do you use. So that's the biggest hurdle to get over with that. We're starting to see fiber end-to-end solutions, but obviously, you have to have the manufacturer's card in the projector and the same manufacturer's transmitter in the source box. So, for instance, Christie might have a fiber card that goes in the projector, and they have a fiber transmit card in the X80. So that's kind of the solution right now. As far as a universal solution for fiber, I think it's a ways off. But I think that's the biggest thing with manufacturers is, okay, whose protocol are you going to use for fiber?
Drew, you've engineered a lot of systems, especially back-end routing components. What's your thoughts on this question as well?
Direct fiber outputs. We've had like fiber output cards on routers, such as like the Lightware modular routers, for years, and it makes for a great system design if you can make it happen. I mean, fiber in general is gonna cost more, right, than like say local output like a DVI HDMI display port. You know, and the issue you get into is if you're in the rental market and you're going to use let's say an image processor like a Spider X80 on different shows all the time, and that system design kind of changes show to show. As soon as you go with like fiber outputs, you're in theory you're stuck with them because you're not going to keep swapping cards out for every show. You know, now all of a sudden you're going fiber outputs to go 6 feet to an LED processor because that's the cards you have, and that starts not really making sense in practical applications. So, you know, I do think we're going to start seeing more like a adoption, I would say, of different format outputs on these processors or media servers, but I don't think it's going to be the traditional like dedicated fiber outputs. I see it more maybe once the industry settles on an IP standard like SDVoE or one of the other 10 gig standards, if and when the industry settles on it. That's a big if, and which one. Seeing more of like SFP modules supported, that you could put your own, you know, 10 gig modules in and support copper outputs or fiber outputs. But I think we're still a ways off on that to see it in a media server or in a image processor. You know, we're still in this transition, and the industry hasn't really settled on a standard yet for IP. So there's still some unknowns there. I think it'll be a little while.
That's a great segue to my next follow-up question. You know, will there be a signal type that we see kind of rise to the forefront, similar to the fact that Dante has had in audio in the live event space? A lot of organizations have taken to using the Dante signal format and audio. So will we see something rise soon? You know, SDI has been highly used, fiber is used, but is there something that's going to be kind of the mainstay as we get to these higher resolutions of a protocol to use?
Well, I'd say to follow up with Drew's mention of it, SMPTE ST2110 was pretty prominent in NAB this year, and that seems to be the direction that the broadcasters are heading with the 10 gig network setup. And I think that's probably the leader right now as far as the IP, video over IP solution. If we do that, that might, you know, circumvent having the need for fiber, because that's going to give you the ability to transport 4K and beyond video over IP networks and have all the advantages of being able to packetize and, you know, distribute through switches all this video signal. So I think that's probably in my opinion, what would be the next big thing.
Drew or Phil, do you have an opinion?
I'm sorry, what? Sorry, Drew.
Oh, go ahead, Phil. I didn't know if that was directed towards somebody specifically or open. You go ahead.
Yeah, this is an open question. So yeah, just checking with Drew and Phil to see if you had any input on a signal that would rise to the top for video.
Well, I'll tell you what it is, but Drew and Tim will disagree with me.
I love a debate. Go for it.
All right, cool. So, you know, as you know, wireless audio has been going on for years, although mostly in live event, you're not going to go wireless. But in the mapping world, a lot of times the conditions are less than ideal, and we do use wireless audio. And it's absolutely working perfectly. Because we can't cross a street or, you know, whatever reasons, the city won't allow us to. So we do use wireless audio. My dream in the future is wireless 8K video signal, but and it will happen, obviously. But I wonder, Drew and Tim, when do you guys think that we'll be able to do 8K wireless video? Do you think within 7 years?
I know manufacturers who have 4K wireless broadcast systems now, so just get 3 more of those, and you're set.
Wow, we should talk, because a lot of times we are so screwed in doing, you know, cable running. So we have to start to find, you know, creative solutions where we, instead of sending the video signal, we send the control to the media that's by the projector.
Okay.
But 8K wireless, I mean 8K, single 8K wireless. Within 7 years, you really do think so?
I think 5 maybe. The 4K stuff right now works in like the 5 gigahertz band, so that's the only limitation to it right now.
Okay, cool. So that's where I think it should be going. But you can never give up on wired, obviously, especially for a show like the Oscars or the Super Bowl. We would never go wireless, but nevertheless, in our world of mapping, it's very promising.
Drew, any final point on that?
Well, if we're looking at, the next generation signal type to standardize on, I definitely think it's going to be an IP standard, which we're not quite there yet. And we might have possible IP standards, like Tim brought up the SMPTE standard for 10 gig that's taking off, and that's really on the broadcast side. And on more of the AV side, if you go to Infocom, everybody was talking about SDVOE as a 10 gig transport medium. So maybe you'll have multiple future signals, but I definitely don't see any copper style signals or traditional signals really knocking SDI off the throne. It's just so standardized in the broadcast market. There's thousands of production studios around the world that just have this massive SDI-based infrastructure, and their only way to really upgrade to 4K in some cases, or even consider 8K, is really to go with an IP-based solution. So, I still hold weight with the broadcast industry and what they standardize on, and what are the big TV studios doing, and how are they going to implement 4K and 8K infrastructure. And the standards they settle on, like SMPTE, will have a big impact for the standards that we see in live events as well.
I don't. This is Phil. I don't know if you guys were at ISC this year. The Infocom of Europe in Amsterdam, but DP Digital Projection introduced I think the world's first 8K projector, or one of the world's first. So projectors will be driving this a lot more, where the more and more we'll get 8K projectors, the more we'll push for 8K infrastructure, where it's 8K across the board, and not 16 HD, but 8K. Big difference.
Got it. Yes, they have been marketing that, and I don't know if it was the first, but it's definitely out there.
Yeah.
So next topic in terms of for the webinar is one that Phil, you alluded to earlier, and there's an and/or in there. So media server and/or high resolution switcher. Now I know obviously there's a different use case in many situations for the two units. One's designed to be more of a playback solution. One's designed to be a content destination management solution. But in using LED, I have seen many people now strictly using media servers, bringing their cameras into the media server, using their playlists almost like presets, to where they're switching and managing the content of their show all through a media server and not through a switcher. So you all kind of shared your opinion of this earlier, but I'm still going to ask the question. Is this a debate, or is it more really about very narrow use case of using a media server and or a high resolution switcher?
Well, I have a question for Drew and Tim on this first. Do you guys know of any true switchers that do playback?
No.
Well, okay. I don't think so. So that would answer your question, Wallace, is that it's not an and or. You need, the media server is a given. The media server is 100% needed. The switcher is not. Because some media servers will act as basic switchers for basic, presets and timeline, creation for queues. So, yeah, I mean, in my case, it's media server and sometimes switchers, but we never run a show without a media server.
Got it. Okay. Fair enough. So we're going to jump down because I want to get your guys' opinion on this. Best products, from a switching standpoint, media server standpoint, from your perspective, from your peers' perspective of what you see in the market. What do you see as kind of best products out there right now in the live event space for switching and media servers? Phil, I'll start with you. From a media server perspective, what do you feel is the best products out there that you're seeing or your peers are using that you're seeing as well?
Well, being that it's sponsored by Dataton, I'm going to say, watch out!
Good
But
answer.
seriously, they're really merging quite a bit now. Everybody's catching up to the big trend. I would say right now the manipulation of live 3D data. So if you change if the client comes to you and say, the projector can't be here, and all your content is mapped from that POV, you'd be able to re-render because your OBJ is texture mapped. So that's a big one. It very rarely happens. So coming answer, well, what's the best? It all depends on your application, but the big three are the big three. D3 Watch Out and Pandora's Box, I would say. Barco Media Server, and for the switchers, usually we're gonna go with E2 Barco or the Spider Christie. Last one we used was E2. If we're gonna use Barco projectors, I suppose we could go with Barco. But again, Barco Christie, they're all fantastic companies, and we don't really care. The client certainly doesn't care, usually. As long as the image is on the screen and looks great, they don't really care. So we'll go with whatever they say. We're very hybrid here.
Cool. We got some questions rolling in. So Tim and Drew, just wanted to see before we jump to those, any additions or difference in the opinion of Phil and what he had as his opinion? Best media server and high resolution switchers in the market right now?
Well, full disclosure, since I work for Barco, I would have to go with the E2. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, this is Drew. I own E2 and I own X20s and I own a couple X80s as well. The new Spiders. They each have their place. E2 has been in the market several years longer than the X80. So I look at like the new Spider X80 as actually kind of next gen compared to the E2 from the standpoint it's built from the ground up for full 4K 60. So I mean, my favorite at the moment is the X80. It's 80 million pixels, so I can do up to 9 full 4K at 60 screens. And it's a 4K powerhouse. All inputs are full 4K, all outputs are full 4K, all layers are full 4K. And when I start doing 4K, I don't have to allocate multiple resources together to get to 4K. Just everything is it's a native 4K processor. So just the sheer amount of processing power the Spider X80 has my vote this year.
Got
Great.
it.
So you're Christie and Drew, and Tim is Barco, and I'm both.
There you go. Very good. We got to a neutral point. So before we jump into questions, I'll open this to all panelists. Outside of resolution, where do you see these technologies going? Is there anywhere specific that you see here in terms of next steps? I know the Spider X80 is fairly new. Barco had a few updates to the E2 with some new cards that were coming out, but in media server world, everybody was just in new hardware solutions and different applications. But anything specific outside of the resolution capabilities of these boxes that you see or hear in development?
I would say from the servers, or not from the switching standpoint, people have been asking for playback inside those units forever. And I think it's something that, the manufacturers look at and they say, okay, well, it's going to take this much hardware to do that. It's going to make this box that much more expensive. And I think at the end of the day, for the live event side, I don't think they like taking away a seat on show site. So I think that's probably the biggest reason why you don't see playback in the switching systems.
Got it. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. If you look at like a live event, especially like a non-touring event, so these corporate events are really a one-off. You really want that separation of responsibility, and as soon as you start having the media server operator also bringing in all these other sources, PowerPoint, demo machines, cameras. Now the media server operator is not just a media server operator. He's the high-res engineer on top of it and, responsible for switching it. And all of a sudden the night before show, there's a massive content dump update, and he's up the entire night with no sleep updating content, plus still having this additional engineering. So, for the corporate events or anything that I'd say is a one-off, it's really preferred now, and I'd see that continue, like Tim said, as separate positions: media server, high-res engineer, switcher, two separate seats.
Right. Yeah, I think that I totally agree with this. Your pipeline is critical. You want your switcher to be just the switcher and the media server to be, typically the media server would be a slave to the switcher, and then the switcher goes to your show. But I not just one-offs. I mean, for those big, I don't know if you consider Super Bowl or Oscars to be one-offs or, but even there, the separation of task, I think, is critical. So then when you get that big update on content, which we get every time we do mapping, the client runs in slow-mo at the end with a stick in his hand going, here you go. And you got 5 hours before showtime. You don't want to start messing with your switcher guy. Then you got your, so you upload on your media server, and the switcher guy doesn't even know, actually, quite frankly. He doesn't even know, nor does he care.
Very good. Well, we got a good list of questions here, but before we go to those, I just want to mention our sponsor for this webinar again, Dataton, with their Watch Out solution, the #1 multi-display product and playback system, perfect for live events and fixed installations. Watch Out is infinitely scalable and supports projection mapping and uncompressed video. So we got 2 minutes left. All of you who are asking questions, we will get you written answers to these questions and post them on the AVNation website. But let's see here. First one here with the SMPTE 2110, how will the lightweight compression such as TICO be adopted, as it is a 2-to-1 compression acceptable?
I think 2-to-1 compression is acceptable for what we're talking about going backgrounds to LED walls or large screen applications. I think the ST2110 is trying to do more of a uncompressed or lightly compressed compression scheme, so it should be comparable to TICO or better.
Okay. Let's see here. Check out another question. Drew, you probably have some info on this. What is your take on UDC control? Do you find it useful?
Take on what?
What is your take on UDC control, and do you find it useful?
Like UDC software?
Yep.
Well, of course I found it useful. That's I developed it. It's one of my companies, HRS and HRS Control. So yeah, I mean we developed that several years back as far as like a show control platform to control routers and switchers and projection and all that kind of stuff from one space. So of course I think it's useful.
And last question before we jump. Currently, 4K and 8K broadcast monitoring requires expensive processing to allow for live camera switching. Are there new solutions in place?
In terms of 4K, I think everything's kind of there. I mean, you've got 12G switchers, you've got quad 4K switchers that don't cost not much more than the HD equivalents. 8K is yet to be seen. That's going to be a huge beast on its own.
Cool. Well, on that note, we will wrap up this webinar. Here's the contact info for all of our panelists and your hosts. So feel free to email them, go to their websites, follow them on their social networks and blogs to see what they're doing and get more amazing content and feedback of the happenings in the live event space. And if you're looking to follow more live event conversations, tune in to the Live Life podcast by AVNation, where I talk to guests in the live event industry about the selling, planning, designing, producing, and delivering of live event productions. So during these talks, we learn about best practices and information that will help you in your day-to-day work environment as live event professionals. So you can subscribe to that show on iTunes, YouTube, or go to the AVNation website. Where we keep the show notes as well. So for those who ask questions, we will get answers from the panelists to these questions and post those on the AVNation website. And if you follow me on social, I'll post a note on LinkedIn, Twitter, when that information is updated and available. So thank you again for attending this webinar. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, our sponsors, Dataton and their Watch Out solution. And most importantly, thank you, AVNation, for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.